Greetings and welcome to Conversations at Noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. I'm Tammy Denise. In 1995, the General Assembly established the Connecticut Freedom Trail as a way to recognize the Black and African American community, along with other marginalized populations' fight for freedom, equity, and to tell these inclusive stories in Connecticut, as well as to mark sites that bear witness to milestones in that quest. Today's topic will be about Prudence Crandall's museum and the curator, Joni DiMartino. She will talk about how, I'm sorry. Let me just give you her bio and then we'll take it from there. Joni DiMartino is the museum curator and the site superintendent of the Prudence Crandall Museum in Canterbury, Connecticut. She earned her MA in Public History from Rutgers University. She has been in the museum field for over 25 years, working at many different sites from large institutions such as the Kentucky Historical Society and the Mystic Seaport Museum to small historic house museums as well. Joni serves as the Connecticut History Day Advisory Council. She is a board member and program chair for the Connecticut League of History organizations. She is also the Connecticut coordinator of the Votes for Women's Trail through the National Collaborative of Women's History Sites. She lives in Connecticut with her family, and she also serves the community as a justice of the peace. Today, we're going to discover the Prudence Crandall Museum, a National Historic Landmark located in Canterbury, Connecticut. In 1832, Crandall, the white principal of the Canterbury Female Boarding School, was approached by a young Black woman named Sarah Harris, asking to attend her academy. Now, when residents protested the school's integration and parents threatened to withdraw their students, Crandall closed her school and reopened in 1833 for Black students. Her students came from several states. Connecticut responded by passing the Black law, which prevented out-of-state Black students from attending school in Connecticut without town approval. She was approached by a young Black woman named Sarah Harris asking to attend the academy. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me turn this over to Joni DiMartino. Joni?
Thank you so much, Tammy. I would like to take a moment to thank Tammy Denise and Mariana Garcia from the Connecticut Democracy Center and Old State House and the Connecticut Freedom Trail for inviting me here today to share the legacy of Prudence Crandall, Sarah Harris, and their historic struggle for education and social justice that occurred right here in Connecticut, in the northeast corner of the state, in a town called Canterbury. I also want to take a moment to thank Doctors Cabria Baumgardner, Jennifer Rasenga, and Manisha Sinha for their scholarship, which has shaped the new interpretation of the Prudence Crandall Museum, including the information that I'm going to be sharing with you here today. I want to add that my presentation today is actually going to begin where most presentations about Prudence Crandall and the Canterbury Female Boarding School end, and that's with the closing of the school. But for those who are unfamiliar with the story, Tammy did share a small portion of that, but I am going to give a very small nutshell overview of that story as well, and then we're going to get into what the legacy of the school was. I'm going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint. Okay, screen one is just... It is just sharing. Mariana or Tammy, can you help me through this? I have my PowerPoint set up on my screen, and I know my computer.
Oh, can you not see it on the share options?
Yeah, I see share options, and it says share screen, and it is sharing exactly the screen that I'm seeing, which is the two of us.
Can you go to the one that says window?
There we go. Thank you.
Oh, there we go. All right.
So if you can all see that, try and full screen it. Oh, goodness. All right. So we're just going to go this way. Okay. In 1831, Prudence Crandall was asked by town leaders to start a private school.
Sorry. Sorry, so sorry, Joni, but we lost your screen.
Oh,
Oh, do you want me to pull it up for you?
sure.
Okay, hold on. Sorry about that, everybody. Small. Oh, here we go. Okay, yeah. Joni, just let me know when you want me to go to the next slide.
Okay. So let's start with the slide number 2, the one of the 1830 sketch of the Canterbury Green, please. So in 1831, Prudence Crandall was asked by town leaders to start a private school of higher education for young women. At this time, white students attended. While running her school, Crandall had conversations with Mariah Davis, who was a free Black woman who worked as a household assistant at the school. Davis informally joined classes at the school after she completed her tasks, and she shared copies of William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, with Crandall. Could we go to the next slide, please? Should be the masthead of The Liberator. Garrison was publishing the writings of Hartford native Mariah Stewart, who wrote several essays about the need for higher education for Black women. If we could go to slide 4, please. 1 year later, in the fall of 1832, a 20-year-old Black woman named Sarah Harris, daughter of local farmers William Harris and Sally Prentice Harris, asked to attend the school. Crandall admitted Harris as a student. The town did not want the school integrated, and many parents withdrew their daughters. We could go to slide 5, please. Crandall responded by closing the school in March of 1833. She reopened a month later in April for non-white students. Many of the new students came from out of state. They were from Philadelphia, New York City, Boston, and Providence. In direct response, Connecticut passed the Black Law, which made it illegal for Black and brown students from other states to attend schools in Connecticut towns without prior approval. Under this law, Crandall was arrested, spent 1 night in jail, and was tried twice in court. Her conviction as her second trial was appealed. Although the appeals case was dismissed on a technicality, in August of 1834, Crandall could still legally operate her school. But the Canterbury Female Boarding School, as it was called, ended abruptly after a nighttime mob attacked it 1 month later, on September 9th of 1834. We could go to slide 6, please. Yet the story of Prudence Crandall's Canterbury Female Boarding School did not end when the school closed due to mob violence. These events made national and international news in the 1830s and galvanized the burgeoning abolitionist movement. Crandall versus Connecticut impacted 2 U.S. Supreme Court cases and laid the foundation for a constitutional amendment. Many former students became nationally renowned educators and reformers. And I'd like to use my time with you today to share the story of several of the students, the impact of Crandall v. Connecticut on civil rights, and to share why this history is still important today. And very often I'll read an article or a blog post, or somebody will refer to the school as having been ill-fated, but I contend that actually it was quite a success. And as I mentioned, the scholars that I referenced earlier, recent historical scholarship really argues that, when you look to see what the students went on to do, as well as the impact, the reverberations that Crandall's trials had well into the 20th century and potentially the 21st, this school was really an amazing success. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. Slide 7, please. And we're going to start very briefly for just a quick look at Crandall's life post-Canterbury. A month before the school was attacked, Prudence Crandall married a Baptist minister, Reverend Calvin Filio. He was a widower with 3 children. It was not a happy marriage. After the closing of the school, they moved to New York, and later Crandall moved by herself. She left her husband with members of the Crandall family to Illinois. Throughout these transitions, she managed several times to run a formal school, including an integrated school in Providence in the 1840s. While she lived in Illinois, she established the Filio Academy and managed a farm and family care. She had care of some of her nieces and nephews. Her aged mother moved in with her for some time. Crandall's grandniece, Rena Clisby, in an unpublished memoir called Canterbury Pilgrims, recalled that one local neighbor claimed, quote, "Our children would have grown up fools if it hadn't been for Mrs. Filio," unquote. After her husband's death, Crandall moved to Kansas with her brother, where she is buried. Crandall, throughout her life, continued to support abolition. She embraced spiritualism and worked for women's suffrage and temperance throughout her life. A roster of the students of the Canterbury Female Boarding School has yet to be found, but scholars have been able to learn the names of most of her students through court records, letters, census records, marriage certificates, and memoirs. Through these same records, it has been discovered that most of the students had a mixed racial heritage, and that many of them came from upper middle class families. A few students, such as Elizabeth Douglas Bustle from Pennsylvania and Theodosia DeGrasse from New York, were considered wealthy. Most of the parents of the students were prominent abolitionists in their communities and viewed the education provided to their daughters by the Canterbury School as a step toward equality. And equality, education, and social justice were causes to which several of her students, like Prudence Crandall, would dedicate their lives. Slide 8, please. Sarah Harris of Canterbury, Connecticut, was the first official Black student of Crandall's Canterbury Female Boarding School. She married blacksmith George Fairweather on November 28, 1833, in a double wedding with her brother, Charles Harris, who married Mariah Davis, who I mentioned earlier was a household assistant at the school. It does not appear that either of these young women attended classes after they married. Mariah Davis Harris and her husband Charles later moved to Norwich, Connecticut, and opened a successful restaurant. The Harris family, I should mention, were originally from Norwich, Connecticut, and it was her parents, William and Sally Prentice Harris, who purchased property in Canterbury and moved there in the early 1830s. Sarah and George Fairweather eventually moved to Kingston, Rhode Island, where George's family lived. Sarah Fairweather became a prominent member of the abolitionist community, hosting visits from William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. It's also recently been established that she lived in New London, Connecticut, near 2 of her younger sisters, Celinda Anderson and Olive Oney. It's possible that Celinda and Olive attended the Canterbury School also. We have no formal documentation of that, but some historians think it was highly likely, given the fact that both Sarah and her other sister Mary also attended. We have discovered recently, historians, that Olive at least ran a school in New London. Celinda may have as well. More information is being shared by historians in New London, in the New London community, and a recent Black Heritage Trail has been established in New London. So we're really excited about that. There's been a lot of new scholarship unearthed about the different members of the Harris family, and we'll be sharing that at the museum and directing people to New London and Norwich as this information continues to be discovered. The Fairweather home in Kingston, Rhode Island was also a stop on the Underground Railroad, and Sarah Harris Fairweather participated in anti-slavery conventions. On the morning of September 9th, 1834, about 15 hours before the mob attacked the school, Sarah Fairweather gave birth to her first child, a daughter who she named after her teacher, Prudence Crandall Fairweather. Sarah Harris Fairweather stayed in touch with Prudence Crandall Filio throughout her life, And in 1877, she traveled to Kansas to visit Crandall, probably journeying west from a visit to her sister, who I'll talk about in just a moment. Sarah Harris Fairweather died a year later in 1878, and there's a current building on the University of Rhode Island that is named in her honor. The next slide, please, number 9. Mary Harris, Sarah Harris Fairweather's younger sister, married Pelham Williams in 1845. Pelham was a teacher from Norwich, Connecticut, and he moved to Canterbury in the early 1830s. The Harris family, I had already mentioned that in the 1830s. He was an abolitionist, and he served as the president of the Connecticut Convention of Colored Men in 1849. Together, they taught both in Connecticut and then later in New York City. During the Civil War in 1863, they moved with their family down south to New Orleans, Louisiana, with 3 of their children, which I think is just an incredible story during such a tumultuous time to move down south with their children. There they educated formerly enslaved African Americans and became 2 of the first professors at Straight College, which is now known as Dillard University, an HBCU, historically Black college or university. Pelham Williams led the teaching department, and Mary Harris Williams taught English. Their son Arthur also became an educator and married a teacher and principal, Sylvanie Francois. Sylvanie Francois Williams, who was Mary Harris Williams' daughter-in-law, would also undergo the same terrifying experience of having a school destroyed by racist and violent mob in 1899. Mary Harris Williams died just before Sylvanie Williams rebuilt and reopened her school. And like her mother-in-law, Williams fought hard for the educational rights of Black and brown people. Several schools in New Orleans have been named after Sylvanie Williams, and she is still revered today as an early activist for Black education. And I just love that thread of education that you can see going down legacies of generations in the Harris families. Another student of the Canterbury Female Boarding School, Mary Elizabeth Miles, get the next slide, please, was originally from Rhode Island. And again, she also became a teacher. In 1842, 8 years after the Canterbury School closed, Mary Miles was admitted to the West Newton Normal School, a teacher training institution located in Lexington, Massachusetts, which is now known as Framingham State University. And I just want to mention another connection to the school here. I didn't go into detail into all the events that happened here in 1834 in Canterbury, but Samuel May was a reverend and a minister of the Unitarian Church up in Brooklyn, Connecticut. He was one of the strongest supporters of Crandall School and the students. And at the time that Mary Miles was admitted to the West Newton Normal School, Samuel J. May was the principal of that school, and he encouraged her to apply. So we have those connections, that network of people involved in the school still working together for what were known as equal school rights for all. So after she graduated, Mary Miles taught in Boston, Massachusetts, Albany, New York, and later in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she began attending anti-slavery meetings. She met her husband, Henry Bibb, who is that picture up there in the corner up there at the top of the slide from his narrative. And in 1847, they met at the annual meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and they married a year later. We don't, unfortunately, have a photograph yet of Mary Miles Bibb, but I'm hoping one will be discovered somewhere down the line. Henry Bibb was a self-emancipated man from Kentucky, and when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850, the Bibbs made the decision to flee to Canada for safety. In Canada, they became leaders in local anti-slavery societies and started the Voice of the Fugitive, which was the first major newspaper to be published by and for African Canadians. Henry Bibb became a popular speaker. giving abolitionist lectures after publishing his autobiography, Narrative of the Life and Adventures of Henry Bibb, an American Slave, which shared with readers the horrors of slavery. His narrative tells of a few joyful moments too, such as this moment when he met his wife, Mary Miles. I'm going to quote from his narrative. I had the good fortune to be introduced to the favor of a Miss Mary E. Miles of Boston, a lady whom I had frequently heard very highly spoken of for her activity and devotion to the anti-slavery cause, as well as her talent and learning and benevolence in the cause of reforms generally. I was very much impressed with the personal appearance of Miss Miles and was deeply interested in our first interview because I found that her principles and my own were nearly one and the same, unquote. Together, the Bibbs established the final stop on the Underground Railroad, just over the border in Canada, known as the Refugee Home Society in 1851, which helped self-freed African Americans begin life in a new country. In the late 1850s, Mary Bibbs opened a school in Windsor, Ontario. A modern historical marker remembers the Bibbs activism and describes them as, quote, one of the country's most influential couples of African descent, unquote. And I just learned that in 2021, a new park in Sandwich was named the Mary E. Bibb Park, unquote. Like her fellow student, Mary Miles Bibb, Julia Williams, next slide, please, was determined to continue her education after the Canterbury School closed. Originally born in South Carolina, Julia Williams was living in Boston, Massachusetts when she chose to attend the Canterbury School. Scholars are beginning to unearth documents that show that Williams may have been the only student at the Canterbury School who was born enslaved and brought north with her self-emancipated mother. She studied at the Noyes Academy in Canaan, New Hampshire, a school of higher education that was open to Black and white people and men and women. In 1835, the Noyes Academy met the same fate as the Canterbury Female Boarding School when an angry local mob tied 100 oxen to the building and pulled it off its foundation. The mob then began to fire cannons at the home where the African American students were boarding. The students were able to safely escape. The two experiences of racist mob violence in less than 2 years radicalized Julia Williams. She went on to teach for some time in Boston. She married Henry Highland Garnett. That's a picture of Henry Highland Garnett there as well. Again, like with Mary Miles Bibb, we have not yet discovered a photograph of Julia Williams. But Henry Highland Garnett was also a student of the Noyes Academy and was present the night the school was attacked. Garnett was a self-emancipated man who later became a minister. Both completed their education at the Oneida Institute near Utica, New York, before they married. A contemporary of Frederick Douglass, Garnett later broke with Douglass over whether the abolitionists should remain peaceful, with Douglass supporting peace and the Garnetts advocating for more forceful action. As Garnett focused more on his ministry, they moved their family, they had 3 children, only one who survived to adulthood, to Jamaica as missionaries. And while they were in Jamaica, Julia Williams-Garnett founded the Female Industrial School, where she served as principal. After returning to the United States due to poor health, Henry Garnett became the first Black minister to preach a sermon to the United States House of Representatives. Julia Williams Garnett also learned on her return to the States that her sister Diana and Diana's daughter Cordelia, which would be Julia's niece, were to be sold. She assisted in freeing them from bondage, which is a whole nother amazing story that we'll share with you at another time. The Garnett family was living in New York City when riots erupted during the Civil War in 1863. The Garnett family was a prime target for the mob because of their abolitionist work, but their daughter Mary had the foresight to remove their name plaque from the front door, which is probably what saved their lives. At the end of the war, Julia Williams-Garnett worked with the Freedmen's Bureau in Washington, D.C. She died in 1870, and her husband, Henry Garnett, was appointed United States Minister, that was the term for ambassador during that time, to Liberia, Africa in 1881, where he died several months after he arrived. During their life together, Julia Garnett often managed congregational affairs while her husband was on speaking tours. Henry Garnett is said to have credited his wife with inspiring his ideas and his speeches. Julia Garnett's obituary in the Christian Recorder asserted that she, quote, wore herself out in the service of her God and her people, unquote. And along with the accomplishments, these amazing things that the students went on to do afterwards, Crandall's court trials also established a significant legacy. We'll go to the next slide, please. Now, in 1833, Prudence Crandall, as I mentioned, spent one night in jail in the nearby town of Brooklyn, Connecticut, before her first court trial. This trial became the first systemic court case where the argument for Black citizenship was put forward in a court of law. Before the 14th Amendment was passed by Congress in 1868, which granted the right of citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including the formerly enslaved, states denied citizenship to Black and brown people, even those who were not enslaved and born on American soil. William Ellsworth, pictured here, was Prudence Crandall's defense attorney. He argued whether or not Prudence Crandall broke the Black law by teaching out-of-state African-American students, but argued instead that the Black law was unconstitutional because the students she taught were citizens and were therefore entitled to the privileges of citizenship, which included the choice to seek an education in another state. Crandall's first trial ended with the jury undecided. A second trial convicted her, and on appeal, the third trial was dismissed on a technicality, which meant essentially that Prudence Crandall could still operate her school. Of course, it also meant that she could have to go through the process of being arrested again. But that decision sends the townspeople to the point that it most likely led to the mob attack on the school, which closed her school in September of 1834. But these court cases influenced two United States Supreme Court cases. The Dred Scott case, next slide, please, in 1857, where citizenship for African Americans was legally denied. Chief Justice Taney cited Crandall's appeal trial, essentially arguing that because a northern state such as Connecticut did not confirm citizenship to Black and brown people during Crandall's trial in 1834, then clearly that demonstrates the precedent that should be set for the rest of the nation. Crandall was still alive at the time the Dred Scott decision was handed down, and we do not know if she knew that her own trial served as the precedent or as Taney's excuse to not only deny citizenship but remove all remaining rights for Black and brown people. We also don't know what her response was, but we can pretty much surmise that it was very angry probably, or very annoyed at this trial. She still, as I mentioned, continued to work for abolition. She was in touch with William Lloyd Garrison and Sarah Harris Fairweather and other people involved in the abolitionist movement. So she was probably as outraged with this decision as everyone else. Unfortunately, we just have no letters that demonstrate her awareness of whether or not it was connected to her court trials. In the 20th century, in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, segregation in public schools was declared unconstitutional. If we could have the next slide, please, Martiana, thank you. Arguments in Crandall's trial were referred to at least twice. Ellsworth's 1834 argument was described in the 1954 citation as such, quote, although neither slavery nor segregated schools was the issue in the case, the Ellsworth-Goddard argument is one of the classic statements of the social and ethical case for equality of opportunity, irrespective of race, unquote. Constitutional scholar Howard J. Graham was hired in the 1950s by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to research the 14th Amendment in relation to segregation. He referred to Crandall versus Connecticut as the genesis for the 14th Amendment. Note the similarities between attorney William Ellsworth's argument, seen below here, and the first line of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. Quote, "These pupils are human beings born in these states and owe the same obligation to the state and the state's governments as white citizens," unquote. That's from Ellsworth's argument during Prudence Crandall's appeal trial. And the actual Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the states wherein they reside," unquote. Now, it was actually the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment that the Supreme Court determined was violated by the existence of segregated schools, striking down the earlier separate but equal determination of the court under the decision of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. So although Crandall v. Connecticut did not serve as precedent for Brown v. Board, Crandall's legal case was cited by Chief Counsel Thurgood Marshall in his written presentation to the court to lay the foundation for his argument. Quote, "The first comprehensive crystallization of anti-slavery constitutional theory occurred in 1834 in the arguments of Ellsworth and Goddard, two of the outstanding lawyers and statesmen of Connecticut, on the appeal of the conviction of Prudence Crandall," unquote. So for me, that's pretty cool. If we could go to the next slide, please. That, Prudence Crandall's appeal trial has been, quoted in the the written arguments for Brown versus Board of Education. So you can see this really, amazing, it's like dropping the rock in the puddle, the concentric circles of how important what happened here in Canterbury, Connecticut, ends up being those ripples that continue for equal access to education for everyone well into the 20th century and potentially into the 21st century. Access to equal and equitable education is still a struggle for students throughout Connecticut, the nation, and the world. I want to mention one other thing. If we could go to the 16th slide, the next one, the Black Law ends up getting repealed in 1838, but it was repealed by William Ellsworth, of course, who was the defense attorney for Prudence Crandall. He's sworn in as governor of Connecticut in May of 1838, in the beginning of May, and by the end of May, you can see he has already gotten this law appealed. And I also want to mention, too, this isn't in any part of my slides, but Connecticut also becomes the first state to ratify the 14th Amendment, which I think is pretty significant. And I think it's based on the arguments that were happening throughout Connecticut during Crandall's appeal trials, the conversations that people were having, and I think the awareness of the necessity of providing citizenship for Connecticut's Black and Brown citizens. So if we can go to the final slide, please. The Prudence Crandall Museum is the site of the Canterbury Female Boarding School. It's a National Historic Landmark, and we are now an international member of we are a member of the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. And we are still today inspired by the mission that was set in motion between Prudence Crandall, Sarah Harris, and Mariah Davis nearly 2 centuries ago. The story of Crandall School and her brilliant and brave students really has a legacy that spans just as long and can well endure into the 21st century, as I mentioned. And there's Mary Harris there as well. I always love using the one of the older images of Prudence Crandall. I know we're so familiar with the portrait of her that was painted in 1834. And while it is a striking image, we don't have any images of Sarah Harris or Mary Harris during that time. And these women continued to do things throughout their lives. So I think it really is meaningful to have photos of all of these women as they continued throughout their lives to work on equality for everyone. So I'm going to leave you this afternoon as I wrap up with a question to consider. I know how this story inspires me as I reinterpret the museum and how we get ready to open after a 2-year significant restoration process. But I wonder how it might inspire you to continue their work and to strive toward a world where all people have equal access to education. And so you can kind of ponder that and maybe think about possibilities and ways that this story inspires you to work toward that. As I mentioned, we're going to be reopening hopefully next month. We will have a completely empty first floor, but it's really pretty amazing to be on site while there aren't any exhibits on display. And I hope you are able to visit, and I look forward to welcoming you back into the museum. So we can close the slideshow now, and I would love to open the presentation for questions.
Joni, thank you so very much. What a wonderful presentation it was. Please, everyone, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We do have a question from Steve Thornton. Was there a Canterbury student from Hartford?
Not that I'm aware of at the moment. The majority of them did come from other states. I know there was a Connecticut, a couple students, the Glasgow sisters, Miranda and Eliza Glasgow, from Griswold, Connecticut. I'm not aware if there were any from Hartford at this time. We are occasionally still uncovering students that get discovered in records and such, so it's entirely possible.
Awesome. That's the thing about history. Even though it's in the past, it's forever changing. Question. Can you possibly speak to how Prudence Crandall may have felt about having a namesake that was a Black person?
I think she would have been very happy with it. I think she would have been completely honored. I know I certainly would be if anybody named their child after me. But I think more importantly, I think it really speaks to the connection that these not only these women but these families shared. When you look at the I guess what we call the genealogy tree, Sally Prentice Harris's last daughter that she has, middle name is Crandall. So I think there was a lot more community and networking that's going on between these two families. I think they were very close friends, the Harris family and the Crandall family, that I don't think we've really uncovered yet. I think in the past, historians have just kind of viewed this as Sarah Harris just kind of coming and asking a question because she wants to be a student. But I think there was a deeper friendship there that was nurtured not only between the Prudence Crandall and Sarah Harris, but between the Crandall and Harris families. And I think it's very exciting to really kind of look at that and see the potential that was there.
I agree. I think one of the greatest form of respect that you have from someone is to actually pass their particular name on, because that's a very important thing. Your reputation is tied with your name. And so to have someone name their offspring after you is definitely is a little bit more than just an honor. Another question is there a Crandall connection to Mark Twain?
Yeah, it's not like a huge connection, but it's interesting that and people do like to hear about it. Mark Twain, basically, Prudence Crandall kind of gets forgotten for a little while, and then her story gets rediscovered. And when her story is rediscovered, there are a lot of people that are horrified by the way Connecticut, with passing the Black Law and the closing of her school, treated Prudence Crandall. And so Mark Twain becomes one of the people that starts supporting her cause to get a pension to her, passed through the Connecticut legislature. I do want to point out that, part of the reasoning is that Prudence Crandall had her livelihood taken away from her, but so did Sarah Harris, right? Sarah Harris did not get to finish her education. There's nobody that's helping Sarah Harris or her sister or any of the other students get a pension. It's just Prudence Crandall at the time. But Mark Twain, through an agent, offers to purchase the what's now the museum, her former school, and move her back to Connecticut. And Prudence Crandall does not know that Mark Twain is behind this. She's just writing to somebody. She's in Kansas. Her response is very interesting, is that she thanks him for the offer, but says that essentially she's living in Kansas, and she says that the air in Kansas is more conducive to her health. So I find that pretty powerful. But once she finds out that it was Mark Twain that was behind this, she writes him directly, thanks him profusely for the offer, and does ask him for a photograph and some books, because she is a big fan, of course. course. And Mark Twain does oblige. He sends her a set of all of his published books to date, which I understand are still in family hands. But we do have the photograph that he did sign to her, to Prudence Crandall. So small Mark Twain connection, but very fun.
Very fun and powerful. Wow. See, you never know where your champions are, sometimes
Right? Yes.
you never know who's champion on your cause. Please, everyone, continue to put your questions in the chat. Also, if you can take a moment to do our survey, because we would love to know how we're doing, and if we need to do anything to improve, tell us other subjects you would like to hear. Joni, I know that there is a book that was written, and her story is an international story. Can you expound on that a little bit more about the book that was written?
Oh gosh, there have been many books. I'm not sure which one you're talking about. Are you talking about the graphic novel?
I think it's the latest one where you did the forward to it, and it's not even in English yet.
Yes, it is. Gosh, I wish I'd known. I would have held it up. I don't think I have it here yet. It still may be in the other building, but it's called Blanc Autour, which was French, and it translates to white all around, meaning that the students were surrounded by people who were not supportive of them. Yeah, there is apparently a very famous French graphic novelist, and he was at the museum one day. He visited. He was actually on tour for another book, and he was with the American Library Association, and he wrote a graphic novel about the Prudence Crandall and the Canterbury Female School story from the perspective of the students. So they are the main characters in the novel, and he actually, I should mention too that if you want to hear an interview with me and him and the illustrator, the Otis Library for Harris Sisters Month, we did do a Zoom interview with him. But it's come out in several different languages. It's been published in Dutch, in Croatian, in Italian, in Portuguese, in German. So what is incredible about this is that this story, because of this, it's reaching readers that have never would have heard this story, let alone visit the museum. And now they visited the website. I've had people reach out to me. You can read the responses on Goodreads that they've never heard this story, and it's pretty moving. But even during Prudence Crandall's time, she was getting international responses. We do have a few, like a little trinket box holder and a plate that were sent to her internationally in support of her work and what she was doing. So yeah, this story is getting the attention it deserves.
Awesome. We have another question from Allie. Does Prudence Crandall have any descendants that we're aware of?
Not directly, because she didn't have children. Her husband was a widower when they married. He had 3 children, and I should mention that one of her, they called her mother. She had actually a closer connection with her stepchildren or her children than she did with her husband. And one of her grandchildren, her step-grandchildren, Baron, no, it wasn't Baron. I'm sorry. I think it was another one. But anyway, lived with her for a while, and he went on to serve as an officer in the 55th Massachusetts Regiment, which was an African-American or a Black regiment during the Civil War. And he also refused his paycheck when his soldiers were not being paid. He served with one of Garrison's sons. So again, this network of support and abolition is just pretty amazing. And again, once I go on these tangents, I can continue with these amazing stories. However, having said that, her brother Hezekiah, her oldest brother, was married 3 times. He had 10 children. So there is a huge Crandall Association, genealogy association, and many of the descendants that often arrive and that I get to meet with are from Hezekiah's line mostly. But we are in touch also with several descendants of the Harris family, in particular Mary Harris's line.
Oh, wow. The historical connections are just mind-blowing, because you don't realize how many people in history are really connected. But at the same time, it helps you to appreciate that the world is a lot smaller than we realize. And when you go back in time through that research that can take you down that rabbit hole, it is fascinating to know the people who were in each other's circles. We have a comment from Wood Thrush 2. He says it is interesting that another Connecticut Black woman Constance Baker Motley, one of our favorites, an NAACP legal defense fund lawyer, wrote the first brief in Brown versus Board of Education and used successfully by Thurgood Marshall. Yes, she is definitely one of our sheroes on the Connecticut Freedom Trail, and she was also the inspiration to the Honorable Ketanji Brown. So yes, Constance Baker is Motley is one of our favorites. Thank you so very much for that.
And I would love to know, I want to comment on that too, because if anybody knows, I mean, I have not had the opportunity yet to read the newest biography that has come out on Constance Baker Motley, but I would love to know if she was the person that brought attention to Crandall's court cases to Thurgood Marshall. I suspect there was a possibility there, being from Connecticut and being aware of probably all of the legal issues and the law in Connecticut throughout. I would love to be able to say with any kind of definitive, like if we know this, or if there's a letter, if there's even a file somewhere that may surface sometime. But yeah, I wonder that. And I know that my talk today had a lot of legalese in it, but that when you really start looking at the legal impacts that what happened here in Canterbury had, it's pretty amazing. And it's the law that impacts people's lives, really. So yeah,
definitely. I have not read the book yet. I think I have it because I have received several books lately on her, but I have not read it yet. But it is on my to do. There is a Freedom Trail member who may actually know Marta Daniels. So she's a big advocate for Constance Baker Motley. So we can find out. We will definitely find out sooner rather than later. All right, everyone, please continue to have your questions come in, as well as take a look at the survey. Joni, in opening up, what are you hoping will happen with your grand opening, seeing that the school, in a way I could say, has been revamped, if you will? Is that a good way to describe your opening that's going to come up to showcase to the public?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also want to be clear too that we're not planning any sort of grand opening. We're really just opening quietly because we have been closed for 2 years, and it's like the sand has shifted because between COVID and just other things that happen when you're going through a restoration process. The date of when we were supposed to be back in the building changed so often that I really wasn't able to plan a ribbon cutting ceremony and such. So I wanted us to be closed as minimal as possible, which ended up being 2 seasons. So I want to be open now, get us started. Even though we have absolutely no exhibits in the building. So if you do come to see the museum, be prepared that the buildings are empty. I'm happy to give you a tour. We'll be by timed tours, which is going to be new, but I think that gives the best visitor experience to have these conversations and share the story and the meaning that it has for people. But it's also a unique opportunity. I mean, when are you going to be able to experience this building when it's completely empty again? And it just breathes, these walls. Make a talk, truly. I know it's a cliche to say that, but it is amazing to just be here when there's nothing in it. So I think that then it's the building itself which really matters the most. It is the actual place. So I still hope that people come and visit us. And I am in the process of working with an exhibit designer. We have a script ready, and I'm going to be meeting with the company that hopefully will be making the exhibit stuff this week. And you're gonna be watching it be created. And then once we have everything kind of better established, we know how the flow goes, and we know when we can plan a date where we can invite dignitaries and have a formal ribbon cutting and a big ceremony. That's when we'll be planning a more formal event. So it's going to be
awesome. Well, I can speak to being in the house while it is empty. It is an awesome experience to be there. It's as if you could really imagine the women walking through the hallways of the school and what each day would have been like, what even a particular school day could have been like in the actual building itself. So I enjoyed that, and I think others will too if they actually just go to see the house in its natural state before the inputs of or the impact of humans. So if you get a chance to see it before all of the exhibit goes back in, I definitely encourage it. It was a wonderful experience to be able to just walk through the house and just feel the house literally breathe. It was just it was a different experience, and it was a wonderful experience. So thank you for that. um Aaron Good would like to know, do you know of any connections between Crandall and the parallel efforts to create a college or trade school for African Americans in New Haven in 1831? Great question, Aaron. Thank you.
It's an excellent question. And the short answer is that there really weren't any. In 1831, 1830, Crandall's teaching in district schools, one-room schoolhouses, and that's actually the year that the townspeople approach her, the town leaders, to start a school. The idea of female education itself is considered fairly progressive at the time, and she purchases the school that year. And it's really the supporters of that school, the school that does not get off the ground in New Haven, that show their support and put their efforts into Crandall School, like Simeon Jocelyn, for example. But I do want to say that, and it's important to point out that part of the reason Crandall is really not involved in those efforts is because she's really not an abolitionist at that time. She's not an activist the way she becomes one. She's raised a Quaker. She's left the Quaker faith by the time she starts this school, but she's not of like the Lucretia Mott, activist, family of Quakers. They're mostly, the Crandalls are pretty much quiet and just kind of go about their business. And so it really is Mariah Davis, who is engaged to Charles Harris, who is with his father, a distributor of the Liberator, who's really engaging Prudence Crandall in these conversations and sharing these copies that have the writings by Mariah Stewart, because Prudence Crandall, above everything, is an educator. She is just an intrinsic teacher, and she wants everyone to learn, and she sees the importance of education. And she writes to William Lloyd Garrison when she determines that she is going to only teach Black and brown students, that she finds that this is what she's got to offer to oppressed communities, and this is where she feels that she can make the most difference in people's lives. So it is really Mariah Davis and Sarah Harris that put Prudence Crandall on that path of abolitionist and activism.
Wow, thank you so very much. Well, let's see. What classes, Mariana would like to know, what classes was Crandall teaching at the school? Do we have that information?
We do, yes. And we know this because she advertised it in the Liberator. And she was advertising not in the Liberator, but in local newspapers what her classes were. So you can see that she did not change her courses. It was a school of higher education. And it was classes like arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, natural and moral philosophy. Natural philosophy was what we now call environmental science today. History, trying to think of other courses, but geography. It was pretty significant. And she was not the only teacher here. Her sister Elmira taught here. Mary Burley and her brother Charles Burley. William Burley also taught here. Charles Burley started the Unionist newspaper to support the school. So yes, she had occasional lecturers that would come in from time to time as well, and other things. French was also taught, and piano as well. But it was definitely not your finishing school variety of a school. It was a pretty rigorous intellectual curriculum.
See, I like that because a lot of times finishing schools was teaching women how to be arm candy, if you will, how to make your man look good, which there's nothing wrong with that. But I like the fact that she was emphasizing on the fact that there was so much more to women than just their looks, that they had brains as well. So I love that. Well, Joni, thank you so very much. We have come to the end of our show today. I really appreciate you coming in, and I hope you will come back again to talk a little bit more once the museum is open and talk to us about the exhibits. Thank you so very much. Again, everyone out there, thank you so very much for joining us. Thank you for your questions. Again, if you get an opportunity, please fill out the survey because we would love to hear from you. Let us know what other topics you would like to hear. Our next upcoming program will be The Perils of Pennington, featuring Andre Kitt, the Great Heart Griot. And in July, our next conversation at noon in July will be Venture Smith, which features Elizabeth Norman from Connecticut Explored, Elizabeth Wood, Stonington Historical Society, as well as Dr. Carl Stafko, who was the organizer of the Venture Smith Day that happens every September. So thank you all again very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at the next conversation at noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. Until the next time.
Thank you.